Hello and welcome to FTSE Funds and Finance, episode number 7 from Goodwin Financial Services, the straight talking financial podcast. I'm joined once again by Steve Goodwin and Josh Goodwin. How are we doing, gentlemen?
Yeah, good, thank you.
It's been a good week, so it's very good news for everybody. So it makes their job a lot easier.
Yeah, we're going to get on to that. So we're going to touch on the markets first of all, and then we're going to talk about the importance of will writing. But let's touch on the markets and what's happened this week. So just give us a little update, the pair of you, on the market so far and on where we're sitting.
So something that we have said is that we felt that the American inflation figures were over-egged and they were higher than they should be. And we also said that Jerome Powell is, every time he announces something, he's being the eternal pessimist on purpose and forcing the markets down. Well, last week, America unveiled its inflation rate and it's falling. And the markets, especially growth stocks, responded really favourably. On Friday, we saw one of the biggest one-day rises. It has continued through this week. And we have seen asset prices spike, pretty much in line with the prediction we made in February this year, which was that the first 9 months would fall and the last 3 months would rise. So, sometimes there are things going on and things that are said for certain purposes, but the reality is that the American inflation rate was not as bad as the federal bank were trying to portray.
And as we said time and time again, a time before, Josh, is inflation erodes wealth. So getting inflation under control in both America and UK is important because obviously it just erodes wealth.
Yeah, it's a huge issue. As you can see, every single central bank's trying to tackle it. Some doing it in slightly different ways. Hopefully we will see interest rates not peak as high potentially as originally thought, which would be quite nice for homeowners. But if it's getting under control in the US, usually that will filter out to the rest of the world. So hopefully we start following soon.
And as you said, Steve, so some of the markets have picked up a little bit this week, a little bit more stability. Looking ahead into next week, obviously we've got the announcement for the UK budget soon. What impact do we expect, the pair of you expect to have over, the coming weeks with that? Obviously we don't know what's in it, but what's our basic predictions or things to look out for?
When you say impact, do you mean impact as in to the nation or impact to the markets? Well,
both really, and also the impact on the average Joe, the person, and where they would see it. What do we think is going to happen, and across all of those, the markets and the nation and people's pockets?
I think the average person probably won't see too much difference. They just seem to be freezing allowances. I've seen they're going to go after the capital gains tax allowance, looking at halving that potentially. I did see stuff rumoured that they were going to potentially offer dividends, but that seems to have died down. The cut, they're obviously they're looking to do about 50% cuts, 50% tax increases. It's more going back to the austerity measures of Osborne and Cameron. That's the issue for me. Austerity showing not to work, but they're going back to it in one way or another. Mm-hmm. So that does make me a bit worried that the state the NHS is going to be left in. That's the place the average man might feel it rather than the tax situation.
Because obviously we don't know if there is austerity where they're going to make those cuts. And what do we expect with the markets then, Steve, to expect the difference on that?
Well, I totally agree with what Josh has just said. I think a lot of the taxation is going to be hidden, like freezing inheritance tax, probably not, attacking capital gains tax. These are things that the average person won't feel, and if inflation is going up 10% and you do nothing with inheritance tax, they've increased their tax rate by 10%. Mm-hmm. So, in reality, I totally agree that there's not going to be a lot of notice. I also think there's been enough leaks to the stock market for people to realise what's coming. So you've got to, I always say to everybody, stock market works 3 to 30 months ahead. Mm-hmm. And it's not what's happening today that affects, it's what they see coming down the tracks. And therefore, I think that with the interviews that Hunter's done, he's pre-warned everybody what's coming. Mm-hmm. So we know pretty much in what sort of form it is going to come. And I don't see it having any effect. Markets have been picking up. I don't see what Hunt does this week having any major effect on that. But unless there are some surprises,
unless he changes, unless something comes out that hasn't been leaked or predicted, then that might.
We expect most of it to be priced into the market already in terms of looking ahead. All right, so that's the overview of the markets and the financial news. The main thing we're going to talk about today is wills and the importance of will writing. Just a caveat here, will writing isn't a regulated service by the FCA, the Financial Conduct Authority, which is what regulates us and our financial service. But it should be, because it's so important. But it is important to make a distinction that it's not regulated by the FCA. So wills is a difficult subject, I think, for a lot of people to have, especially people my age. I'm 40 years old. I think a lot of parents and etc. don't want to think about writing a will because of the morbid of the fact of writing a will. And I think some people assume it's a medium for older people, but I think we're going to debunk a few of those issues now about the importance of will writing. So I just wanted to know if you can outline why it's so important that you have a will and the impact if you don't.
Yeah, I mean, let me just firstly say the second issue people have with writing wills is that there are certain will writers that you see all the complaints, so they go around people's houses and they just try and sell them add-on after add-on after add-on. Mm-hmm. And it's like somebody being faced with a double glazing salesman.
Yeah.
So it puts people off trying to write one. Now, they can go to solicitors, but they can be really, really expensive. Or they can get somebody round who can often just be flogging them additional add-ons. There are ways of avoiding both of those scenarios. And again, we help our clients with that. But going back to why it's important to write a will, people think that everything automatically goes down the tracks, and it doesn't happen like that. So let's take a couple of important things first. So you're married, you've got a will, you get divorced. You think that the will is invalid. It's not. So if you've really fallen out with your wife or your husband and you don't rewrite your will, then they're still going to inherit that money. And without a new will, the money's not going necessarily to where you want it to go to.
So just to reiterate that point, divorce does not dissolve the will.
But a marriage does. Don't ask me the reason why, it makes no sense to me.
And so to clarify that point, marriage does. Obviously, if you've got a will before you marry, if you marry, then obviously, then naturally the wife or husband is entitled to things. That obviously why marriage dissolves the will effectively.
Yeah. So therefore you would become intestate if you don't make a new will. And the second thing that we need to cover particularly is without a will, you don't have executors to carry out your wishes. Your laws of intestacy does not nominate executors. You don't have guardians nominated to look after your children. But also, if you are married, your wife doesn't automatically inherit it if you've got children. So the basic scenario of a will is if you are married and you have children and you die without a will, your wife or husband only gets the first £270,000. And the rest of the estate is then divided up. They get a lifetime interest in half, but the children get half as well. So you end up with half and half. So if the house is worth more than 270,000, it means that the wife or husband doesn't automatically get all of the house unless it is written as joint tenants on the agreement. If anything is joint tenants, we have a joint account that is automatically inherited by the spouse. But it starts to get complicated at this stage, but the simplest way of avoiding the complication is to write the will in the first place, because it can get very, very messy.
So again, just to pick out the key points in that, if you're married and you don't have a will, unless it's a joint tenancy, joint account, your partner, your surviving spouse, does not inherit everything.
Correct.
Which is an assumption that a lot of people make around wills, isn't it? They think that once you're married, you hear everything, obviously everything ties together, but it's not as straightforward as that. And what happens, the difference if you haven't got a will? So what happens then, if someone passes away, haven't got a will, what differences can that make? You mentioned about executors. Can you just tell us a little bit more about what an executor does? And you said about guardians as well, Steve. I just didn't know, Josh, if you could mention obviously what you mean by guardians, because people may not necessarily know what necessarily that means.
The guardian side is just the people you choose to look after your children. It's quite as straightforward as that, really. And the executors of the will are the ones that make sure that everything you put down in the will is acted as it should be. So that's really key that you choose the right people for that, and you don't. And there's some little tricks and trades that you should do, and who you choose, how many you choose. But that's down to personal stuff.
I think that's a big one for me as a father of 3 daughters, having guardians set out to make sure who looks after my children. I think is an important issue to consider, especially if both myself and my wife pass at the same time. It's important to make sure you've got the right people.
Well, I've heard a story of somebody who didn't have a will, didn't nominate guardians or executors. Somebody in the family saw a great opportunity and became guardians to the children, managed to strip all the assets down, and by the time the children were 16, they were in a home because they'd spent all the money. Now, not saying that happens everywhere, but a will does at least put in some provisions of protection, because you allocate who's going to be in charge of all this stuff. So on top of everything else, that's very important. So for what it costs, a will should be an essential for anybody who has assets.
And so obviously you said about divorce doesn't also, I think that's an important distinction to make. I also know that unmarried partners or partners with an unregistered civil partnership don't necessarily inherit from each other.
No,
So civil partnership is important as well, making sure that's registered, because obviously they won't necessarily. What have people got to consider to make a will legal? So obviously I know there's certain things that a will has to have, but can you just clarify if someone doesn't know what the things needed to be to make a will legal and be a correct?
Well, you have to have beneficiaries. You have to decide what age your children inherit, when they can get it absolutely. You need executors, you need guardians. You ideally want funeral instructions to what happens if you die. And you want, you want all of those things documented so that your children, everybody's protected. And you don't have to wait to go through a long probate issue. The other problem is also, administering a will and being an executor will is not overly complicated. It's a bit time consuming, but it's not overly complicated. If you don't have a will, a solicitor could pick up the job, and they can take quite a substantial amount of money from a will. So, if that's what you want to do, that's great, but you leave things open for massive costs and charges if you've got people in your family who are close to you who are quite capable of doing the probate and being the executors. So it really is something that everybody should have, and you should think of and do it. And we explain to our clients what the options are to making a will without feeling like you're being sold to by a second-hand or a double glazing salesman or a second-hand car dealer. So that's very important. But because that's the problem, because it's an unregulated industry, nobody regulates the people that do this
and their behaviour and their ethics
and that's. That is the problem. There is an association of will writers and all that sort of stuff, but it does, but it's not the same as having the FCA and the Financial Services regulation.
Can we just touch on some common mistakes? I've wrote down here some common mistakes that people do in a will. I don't know if we could touch on it a little bit more. So one of them is obviously failing to account for all the money and property in a will. Coming back to what we said last week when we were talking about pensions, important that people keep records of everything effectively.
Yeah, exactly. That's why part of the service we do when we do the full fact find is going deep into person's financial background and making sure you get all that information. Because as you say, if you don't allocate all the money, then the will doesn't really fulfil its job, does it?
No, exactly that. And we mentioned last week about pension pots, about keeping hold of those. So this is another reason why it's so important to keep a track of everything. The other one, which is always a difficult thing to talk about, is the failing to plan for the possibility that the beneficiaries pass away before you do.
Yeah.
And that can cause problems as well.
Yeah, but sometimes most times you'd write a will, you would have a second option off if the beneficiaries died or or something happened where you and your wife were away with you and your 2 children and you died in a plane crash, what happened to your money then? You'd have like an emergency clause effectively, deciding where the money would go.
And that's even more reason why you need to have a will, because to plan for these eventualities.
Yeah, and they do happen.
Yeah, unfortunately it does. And also, which we touched on slightly, is obviously the importance of changing your will once your circumstances change, because as we've already touched on already about the difference between that. Is there anything else you can think of we haven't touched on in terms of wills that the average person would need to know or for them to consider?
I'll say, just to reiterate that point you said there, wills should be updated regularly when your circumstances change. People's circumstances change a lot, and very, very few people actually update their wills. And I would say that's probably one of the key points.
It is something we do when we review our clients annually, which is what we do. We do check the will provisions and make sure that they're valid for them and advise them if to do something if not. And I think a lot of the other advice you give clients is sort of done on a one-to-one basis.
Sure.
And yeah, we can help them. I think it's something that, as a financial advisor firm, we help clients in all aspects of their financial life, not just get fees when they invest or get fees when we advise. We try to help everybody get better deposit accounts, help them with their wills. These are important things, and that's what a good financial advisor does to help, in helping their clients.
And that's important. It's with the clients you have and we see is it's a case of we're on this financial journey for life. It's we're partners with you in all aspects of it. And then obviously the wills, as you said, Steve, you review the will provisions. There's also things you talk about within lasting power of attorneys, which is possibly another topic for a podcast another time. But again, it's the whole scope you look at when reviewing with the clients to making sure they're in the best possible position.
Exactly that.
Okay, so that sort of wraps up will writing, and hopefully that gives you some good information and the importance of getting a will. As you said, the will writing isn't regulated by the FCA. However, Content Goodwin Financial Services can put you in touch with companies to be able to do that effectively and cost effectively as well. If you've got any more topics you'd like us to discuss, this was a recommendation from one of our clients about one of the things to cover. Please get in contact, either email info@goodwin-financial.co.uk or comment on one of these questions below, or hit up Steve or Josh on social media, etc. Gentlemen, thank you very much, and we'll bring you the news next week.